examples.
Well, I think it's complicated to think of what one means by rationality in this context, because, you know, at the moment, you might really want to do something and very rationally pursue that goal, even though it's not in your interest in the long term. So imagine that I'm a cocaine addict, and I'm like desperately searching after cocaine, right? I might be really, really smart about ways to get cocaine. I might figure out how to rob a store or whatever. But in the long term, it's really not in my interest to do any of that stuff.
Like, so maybe a truly rational individual, though, would try to optimize the utility across, like, the long run, is what I'm saying.
Well, it's an interesting question, but I think it's hard to make that. If you're really interested in this, you should come to my lecture this afternoon from 1:30 to 2:50, because I'm talking all about this. But, I mean, I think it's really hard to make that argument, because, so, why should you, there's actually this beautiful book called Reasons and Persons that's all about this. So, why should you care more about yourself in 50 years than you care about Amanda? Amanda is sitting right next to you right now. Shouldn't you look out just as much for her interest as you do for yourself?
Well, I'm going to turn into that 50-year-old person, but I'm not going to turn into Amanda.
Well, what does it mean for you to turn into? I mean, the thing is, it's not exactly you. Like, all the cells in your body will be different at that. I mean, it's very, you know, if you start going down that road, you start thinking, well, in exactly what sense am I the same person as I will be in 50 years? You know, that you're very temporally separated. That person might have all sorts of different views. Imagine you knew that yourself in 50 years would have exactly the opposite set of values from what you do now. So, like, imagine that you were a communist and you, like, believed in, you could very well know, because of various historical forces, that in 50 years you're going to be an investment banker. And you might actually right now want to occupy yourself in 50 years, right? Because you actually support Occupy Wall Street, and you might absolutely hate the person you're going to be in 50 years. Whereas you might think Amanda's a perfectly nice person, right? And so you might actually, so it's not at all clear that you look out for the interests of yourself in 50 years any more than you look out for the person sitting next to you right now. There's a lot of argument to be made that person's actually more related to you than yourself in 50 years is. So I think it's pretty hard to sustain that sort of a view. Anyways, you should look at this book by Parfit. It's on the reading list. It's a very good book. Energy efficiency standards are another classic paternalistic idea which is justified by this type of an analysis. So Alcott and Wozni show that consumers don't respond fully to the energy savings that they could get by buying a more fuel-efficient car, and therefore the people who buy the car are actually worse off than they would be if they were forced to buy a more efficient car. And this is used to justify CAFE standards, which most economists would say are not a very efficient. Sorry, does everyone know what CAFE standards are? No. So CAFE standards require that all of the cars of a company have to like average out to a certain amount of fuel economy. So they have to have some average miles per gallon. That's right. And this is not really the efficient way to deal with pollution or with anything like that, because you should just put a direct tax on whatever it is that's causing the harm. This is obviously addressed more at dealing with the fact that consumers don't make the right decisions about which type of cars to buy. And so it tries to force them to buy more efficient cars. And in fact, what Alcott and Wozni find is that the benefit that that brings to consumers is an order of magnitude bigger than the benefit it brings to the environment. So those things are overwhelmingly designed to help consumers and not to help the environment. Another example might be suicide. We don't let people commit suicide because we think that has externalities on their future self. Even though they at this moment don't want to be alive, they're killing someone in the future who is not necessarily themselves exactly, it's their self in the future, right? I know this is all very strange because it's very easy to fall into this thing of thinking, you know, I am just this coherent thing, you know, across time, but it's not really obvious that that's actually the case. Organ donation is similar to this. It's usually illegal to sell your organs or to become a prostitute because we think that that might impose all sorts of costs on yourself in the future that you're not fully taking into account right now. Okay, so this is an example. So Alcott and Wozni looked at when the price of fuel changes and therefore the value of having a car that's more fuel efficient changes, how much do people change their purchasing behavior of different things? And what they should do is reduce the amount they're willing to pay for really inefficient cars by a lot and increase what they're willing to pay for the most efficient cars by a lot. But in fact, they don't do that, so this is what people actually do, and the red line is what people should do if they were fully taking into account the increased value of having the more efficient car. And this leads them to pay something like $1,000 too little for the most efficient cars and $1,000 too much for the least efficient cars. Okay, so most economists' favorite response to externalities is to impose a tax if the activity is harmful and a subsidy if the activity is beneficial. And this is sort of the simplest solution because it directly creates a price, either positive or negative, for the activity. And the tax has to be equal to the marginal social cost of the activity at the optimal level. That's exactly what Amanda's diagram showed, right? Otherwise, it's not going to play the same role as price, right? It should be playing the role of price, which is that it's always equal to the marginal cost or the marginal benefit. However, the problems can arise because this level, setting just the level of the marginal thing, may not be sufficient to solve the problem. So, like, an example of this is fax machines. So fax machines are only valuable if other people are using fax machines. So everyone who buys a fax machine creates a positive externality for everyone else who currently has a fax machine. But imagine, like, in the early 80s, there was only like 100 people who had a fax machine. So the marginal externality of one more person using a fax machine is very, very small, right? However, as more people got it, it became more valuable. And this meant that it took a long time for the market for fax machines to take off, and that wouldn't have really been solved by just subsidizing it at the current marginal externality. Because the real externality that it was going to end up causing once enough people got it and it was efficient was going to be much larger than that. So it's better to actually subsidize by the marginal externality at the efficient level, or even more than that early on, when there are little benefits to getting the fax machine, and that'll bring you to the efficient level, and then at that point you can just subsidize at the marginal externality. And in fact, this is exactly what a lot of internet companies do. So internet companies like Facebook run systems that are very similar to the fax machine. It's only worth participating if everyone participates. So they usually lose money early on. They don't have advertisements. They don't charge anything to build up a base. And then once they get to an efficient level, well, then they charge something that's closer to just the marginal externality. So this strategy of losing money early on and making it up later, giving a really big subsidy early, and then charging just the marginal externality as a subsidy later, is called the insulating tariff. Okay. Now, the most common practical application of this type of subsidy or tax is taxes on pollution. So, Lawrence White advocated that rather than your cars being required to meet a certain smog standard regardless of where you live, it should depend on where you actually live, because people who live in rural areas, the smog doesn't create much of a problem. People who live in cities, it creates a terrible problem. And so every time you go to get your car assessed, it should be based on an assessment of how much externality it's causing that you're driving around that place. Similarly, the French government puts a little filter above all smokestacks and all power plants and measures all the types of chemicals that are coming out, and then for each one of them charges a tax to force people to internalize the externality. And we'll talk a lot more about this on Thursday, But there's a big push, and currently in Europe they're already doing it, to put in carbon taxes, to tax the amount of carbon that you pollute and that thereby warms up the earth. Now, almost all economists think that the taxation is better than directly regulating, like saying this factory has to emit no more than this much, this factory has to emit no more than this much, which was the classic solution. And Kenneth, why do you think economists prefer the tax solution over the direct regulation?
Because then the firms will decide like how much they want like, to produce. I mean, how much they are like able to afford that tax.
Yeah, so that's right. So the firms that have that are most able to reduce the amount they're polluting will reduce it by a lot. The firms that are less able to reduce the amount they're polluting will reduce it by much less, right? And so Margaret Fowley and her co-authors found that there's a big problem that the way that we deal with nitrogen oxide is that we prohibit companies from producing NOx, but we don't have any regulations that make cars pay for how much NOx they're creating. And as a result of that, cars could reduce NOx much more cheaply than the companies, than the power plants could. And so what they find is that if you had some just tax on producing NOx, rather than like regulating the companies and leaving the cars unregulated, you could reduce the cost of keeping this current level of nitrous oxide by $2 billion. Okay, so to go back to Amanda's graph, and I just want to draw it a little bit bigger. So if we have, here's the marginal private value, here's the marginal social cost, a Pigouvian tax just says, okay, here's the marginal externality. Now we can eliminate the social cost curve, and we can just set a price that's here, right, a tax, and then the market will always produce the optimal level, right? We just set a tax there. The market does the same thing as if it directly took into account the cost. Okay. Now, in the United States, most Pigouvian taxes are actually collected through the legal system. That is, when a firm does something harmful, they get sued. And the court then assesses how large the harm was, and they're forced to pay two types of damages usually, or at least sometimes. Compensatory damages that directly compensate the harm that they caused. And the second type is punitive damages, which are usually paid at least partly to the government rather than to the person. And these deal with the fact that it's hard to bring a lawsuit, and therefore people don't bring lawsuits against everything harmful that's being done. That means that if you do something harmful to someone else, there's only some chance that you're going to get detected, and you'll have to pay the fine. It's not going to be 100%. Maybe you only 1/4 of the time end up getting a lawsuit brought against you. And so if only 1/4 of the time you get the lawsuit brought against you, then you might do too much of the activity. To make you bear the full costs of it, you have to say, well, I'm only going to be caught 1/4 of the time, but in that 1/4 of the time, I might have to pay 4 times the harm that I caused. And so that'll even out to the right amount of the right amount of payment. Another reason why some of the money might get paid to the government rather than to the person who brought the lawsuit is that you want to incentivize people not to be reckless. So people might get into a car with a drunk person if they know that they can